The jungle still held its breath when the first shot came. Dawn bled slowly over the ridges of a nameless Pacific island, washing the mist in silver. The surf rolled somewhere far below, a dull, rhythmic pulse that seemed to keep time with the hearts of the men climbing the narrow path. 10 Japanese infantrymen, weary from weeks of patrols, moved single file beneath the dripping canopy. Their uniforms were damp with night rain. Each step squelched faintly in the soil. Second Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka kept his hand near the hilt of his shin gunto, his other tightening around the worn leather sling of his Arisaka rifle. The jungle had been quiet all morning. Too quiet, he thought, though he would never admit fear to the men behind him. The silence broke with a sound as thin and sharp as glass cracking, the distant report of a rifle. It came from nowhere, or everywhere at once. Tanaka heard the faint hiss of a bullet slicing air. Then the man ahead of him, Private Sato, who had been whispering about breakfast a moment ago, jerked backward as though tugged by an invisible string. His helmet flew from his head. He collapsed wordlessly into the mud. Every man froze. The jungle seemed to contract around them. Birds that had been chattering moments before scattered in frantic wings. No one moved to help Sato. The stillness of his body told them there was no point. Tanaka's mouth went dry. The shot had been so distant it felt impossible, as if death itself had whispered past. "Sniper!" hissed Corporal Ishikawa from the rear, his voice cracking despite his effort at control. But where? Tanaka swept his eyes across the ridges ahead. The fog clung low, curling like breath over rocks and trees. Nothing moved. No muzzle flash, no shape of an enemy. The Americans, he'd been told, were undisciplined, brave at close range, but clumsy at distance. This death made no sense. He gestured sharply for the men to drop. They sank to their knees, rifles out, trying to vanish into the undergrowth. The world filled with small, panicked sounds, labored breathing, the click of safeties, the faint rustle of cloth. Tanaka's own pulse roared in his ears. He was supposed to lead. He was supposed to know. But how do you fight an enemy you cannot see? The seconds stretched long. Then another shot whispered through the mist, and Ishikawa, steady, loud Ishikawa, pitched forward, his rifle clattering on a root. This time Tanaka saw nothing at all, only the way the corporal's body twitched once, then went still. No smoke, no sound except that one faraway crack. Another man shouted and was hushed by a frantic hand. Someone muttered a prayer. The patrol was unraveling, their courage bleeding out with the bodies in the mud. Tanaka forced himself to breathe. The American must be somewhere high, he thought, hidden beyond normal reach. Yet the jungle offered no vantage point, only thick vines and low ridges. Could a single enemy really strike from so far? His instructors had said yes, only in theory, and that theory had seemed remote, academic. Now it was killing his men. He crawled forward to Sato's body, heart hammering. The entry wound was clean, almost surgical, through the side of the helmet and temple. The shot had come from the flank. No, from farther, perhaps over the lagoon beyond the ridge. 1,000 meters? More? Impossible. Yet here was the proof. Behind him, murmurs swelled, the men whispering that the jungle itself was cursed. Someone suggested retreating. Another hissed that cowardice was worse than death. Tanaka clenched his jaw. He had been raised on tales of the samurai spirit, of courage and steel. But his father had also taught him that courage without understanding was suicide. He signaled for silence, his hand trembling only slightly. They would move back, he decided, not as deserters, but as survivors who must report this phantom threat. Then the third shot came, and everything shattered. It struck the radio man, the youngest in the patrol, tearing through his chest and pitching him onto his back. The radio clattered beside him, its antenna bent, his fingers twitching as though reaching for help that could never come. This time, the sound seemed farther still, a faint echo swallowed by mist. 3 men gone, each with a single pull of a distant trigger. Panic broke free. One soldier bolted down the path despite Tanaka's barked command. Another began firing blindly into the trees. The Arisaka's muzzle flashed a frantic plea, rather than an attack. The jungle answered with nothing. No enemy, no movement, only the heavy, watching silence of something unseen and patient. Tanaka felt a heat rise in his chest, a blend of shame and fury. He wanted to charge the invisible shooter, to die in honorable combat, but there was nothing to face. The enemy was not a man with a sword or a banzai yell. It was a calm, unseen eye behind glass, somewhere beyond reach. The war he had been taught to fight, of courage and bayonet charges, felt suddenly obsolete. He gathered the remnants of his patrol with harsh whispers, forcing them back into a staggered retreat. They slid through the undergrowth, every leaf a possible muzzle flash, every rustle a phantom enemy. Once a helmet brushed a vine, and 3 men flinched as if struck. Tanaka kept his voice low, promising safety he didn't feel. Each step away from the ridge felt both cowardly and necessary. When they finally reached a shallow depression near their bivouac line, the men collapsed in exhaustion and terror. Some stared blankly, one wept quietly into his sleeve. Tanaka crouched alone at the edge, gripping his rifle so hard his knuckles whitened. He tried to picture the shooter, perhaps an older American, patient and cold, breathing slow behind a strange, long scope. How many such ghosts lurked out there? How many could kill from a distance their manuals called impossible? As the light grew stronger, he forced himself to stand. He would have to report what happened, though he doubted his superiors would believe it. They had told him the Americans lacked discipline. They had said bravery and numbers would break them. But bravery had not saved Sato, Ishikawa, or the boy with the radio. Something new was on this battlefield. Something methodical, mathematical, merciless. Tanaka looked back once toward the mist-wrapped ridge. The jungle seemed empty, but he could feel eyes on him, cool and distant as a predator studying prey. Somewhere out there, a single Marine lay hidden, rifle steady, watching. Perhaps he even saw Tanaka now and chose not to fire, content to let fear finish the work. The lieutenant turned away, his jaw set, but his stomach cold with doubt. He had faced death before, but never like this. Never from so far. So silent. So detached. War, he realized, might not be about courage at all. It might belong to whoever could master distance and patience, whoever could kill without being seen. As he led his shaken men back toward camp, the radio silent in its broken case, the jungle closed behind them with deceptive calm. The Americans had not charged, had not shown themselves. Yet 3 soldiers lay dead, struck down by a weapon none of them truly understood. Tanaka felt the first crack form in the faith that had carried him across oceans. That spirit alone could win a war. Somewhere out there, beyond the fog and vines, an unseen adversary had just proved otherwise. The sea was a hard, endless gray when Sergeant Daniel McCall first sighted the island through his rifle scope. He was 26, lean from years of training, his skin leathered by Pacific sun and salt. To the men around him, he seemed carved from calm resolve, but inside his chest lived a restlessness sharpened by long months of preparation. McCall had grown up on the Carolina coast, learning to steady his breath while lining up ducks across tidal marshes. The Corps had taken that boyhood patience and forged it into something colder, more exacting. Now, aboard the crowded deck of a transport ship pushing toward Japanese-held territory, he cleaned the barrel of his M1903 Springfield as if it were a sacred instrument. He remembered the first time he'd touched that rifle at Quantico. The instructors there had been quiet men, hard-eyed and deliberate. They spoke less about glory than about control. The stillness of the body, the reading of wind, the heartbeat that must slow before the trigger breaks. McCall had excelled quickly. the 3006 cartridge snapping downrange, punching neat holes at distances that made most recruits squint. The Untold scope, long and spindly, had felt fragile in his hands at first, but soon it became an extension of his eye. Where others saw blur, he saw breath in leaves, shimmer in heat, the flick of a target's shoulder. He learned to disappear in brush, to let hours pass like minutes. War was coming, they'd told him, and the Corps would need men who could kill quietly and far. Not machine gunners, not grenadiers. Ghosts. On the other side of the ocean, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka prepared too, though his world was forged of different steel. He had been taught that a soldier's soul mattered more than his sight line. Japan's military culture celebrated the bayonet charge, the shock of fearless advance. At the academy, he had drilled until his feet bled, shouting oaths to the emperor beneath banners of rising sun. They fired rifles, yes, but always with the understanding that courage, not distance, decided battle. Tanaka had believed this deeply. He wanted to be the kind of officer his father would respect. Unflinching, decisive, ready to lead men into the teeth of enemy fire. Yet the first skirmishes in China had planted quiet doubts. He had seen what modern bullets could do to brave men, how a well-placed shot ended valor in an instant. Still, the doctrine held. His instructors promised that Americans were soft, decadent. They would break when faced with Japanese resolve. Tanaka carried that belief as armor, though it was cracked now by the strange deaths on the jungle ridge. Months before that fateful patrol, McCall had been assigned to a reconnaissance unit preparing for Guadalcanal. He and a handful of others were pulled aside after routine drill and told their skills would be decisive. The Corps had quietly begun shaping a new kind of warrior, the scout sniper. There was no ceremony, only long, grueling days of stalking exercises, camouflage drills, and ballistics study. They practiced crawling through grass until their elbows bled. They memorized wind charts and learned to judge distance by the size of a helmet through a scope. They fired at silhouettes across open beach and deep jungle, pushing the 3006 to its extreme edge. At night, McCall wrote in a small notebook, never about heroism, only about silence. The strange intimacy of watching a distant man breathe through glass. The way pulling a trigger could feel less like rage and more like shutting a door. He didn't know what the first kill would do to him. No one did. The instructors only said, stay calm, stay hidden, stay alive. Tanaka, meanwhile, drilled his men for close assault. On ship decks bound south, he stood beneath humid skies and spoke of honor. They sharpened bayonets and learned to scream as they charged, to terrify the enemy with the force of spirit. Few had seen an American rifle fired beyond a few hundred meters. Their supply officers scrounged ammunition sparingly, believing battles would be decided at hand's reach. When Tanaka requested additional optics or marksmanship training, his requests were dismissed as unnecessary. The Imperial Army valued aggression over patience. He swallowed his misgivings and obeyed. By the time McCall's unit landed on Guadalcanal, the air was heavy with rot and fear. Jungle swallowed sound. Mud clung to boots. Marines dug in, wary of an enemy said to fight without surrender. McCall spent his first nights listening. The distant cough of rifles, the deeper boom of artillery, the rustle of unseen patrols. The first time he raised his scope against a living man, it wasn't in open battle but in silent reconnaissance. A Japanese courier crossing a clearing paused to adjust his pack. McCall held his breath, felt his heart slow and squeezed. The man dropped without a cry. McCall stayed prone, watching the body for long minutes, tasting salt and something like guilt. That night he said nothing. The next day he made another shot and another. Each grew easier, though never weightless. For Tanaka, whispers of these unseen killers arrived before he met them. Units reported strange casualties. Men struck down from impossible ranges, patrols frozen by a single well-placed shot. Superiors dismissed the stories as exaggerations. Americans cannot shoot so far, one colonel told him. But when Tanaka led that ill-fated patrol into mist and lost 3 men to a single unseen Marine, belief shattered. He returned shaken, forced to revise everything he had been taught. Back in the Marine lines, McCall's legend was growing quietly. Commanders began sending him ahead of assaults, his task to break defenses before they even saw Marines approach. He would lie for hours beneath tangled vines, sweat dripping into his eyes, waiting for the single head to rise above a trench. The Springfield was old compared to the new semi-automatic Garands most Marines carried, but its bolt-action reliability and accuracy made it deadly. His inertial scope, delicate and awkward to some, let him read the battlefield like a secret map. McCall himself felt no glory. Each shot was a calculation: wind, range, heartbeat, the faint shimmer of heat. Yet he understood the power it gave. How a single rifle could unnerve an entire enemy line. The Japanese came slower when snipers were rumored near. Runners faltered. Gun crews hesitated to expose themselves. One patient man could stall a company. Tanaka now carried his own private war. He began ordering scouts to move cautiously, to search ridges for glass and metal glints. He taught his soldiers to crawl rather than charge when unseen fire cut through ranks. But resources were thin. His requests for counter-sniper training went ignored. The Army clung to its creed of spirit over science, even as men died to invisible math. Tanaka felt loyalty erode beneath each letter he wrote home. Letters he never dared describe honestly. On the eve of another planned assault, McCall cleaned his rifle in silence. The Marines would push inland at first light. Somewhere ahead, Japanese troops were digging in, perhaps believing their courage would hold the line. McCall thought of the young officer he'd glimpsed through glass days before, leading men with rigid pride. He hadn't taken the shot then. Range and angle were poor. Tomorrow might be different. War, he knew now, was not about honor, but angles, patience, and precision. Tanaka stood that same night beneath a sagging tarp as rain drummed overhead. He traced the map by lantern glow, noting ridges and sight lines with a worry he dared not voice. He could almost feel the unseen American watching already, scope steady, waiting. His men slept around him, trusting in his certainty. But certainty had abandoned him on the ridge where 3 fell in silence. Somewhere between them, the jungle kept its secrets. By dawn, one man would be hunter, the other hunted. And the war both had trained for, one built on courage, the other on calculation, was about to collide in a way neither fully understood. Rain slicked the jungle leaves the morning McCall crawled into position. Each movement was deliberate, knees sliding an inch, elbows easing forward through the black soil, breath measured so no sudden puff of air would betray him. Above the canopy, gray clouds sagged heavy with moisture, turning the light flat and ghostly. He had left the Marine perimeter hours before dawn, alone but for his Springfield slung tight against his chest. Now, at the edge of a narrow clearing, he melted into a lattice of roots and fern. Insects swarmed his face and he did not flinch. Patience was survival. He studied the slope opposite through his inertial scope. The world narrowed to crosshairs and the faint, almost imperceptible sway of his own heartbeat. There, a camouflaged foxhole, its occupants unaware. 2 Japanese soldiers were setting up a light machine gun, laughing softly as they worked. He watched the younger one adjust the feed belt with boyish clumsiness, the older giving instructions in quick, hushed tones. McCall did not feel hatred, only a cool, distant focus. He adjusted for range, 900 yards, maybe a touch more. Wind teased the jungle tops, invisible but betrayed by drifting leaves. He calculated the bullet's arc as if solving an equation. At Quantico, they had taught him this science like a sacred ritual. Measure the wind, Count the heartbeats. Exhale until the lungs are almost empty, then squeeze, never pull, the trigger. The Springfield's 30-06 cartridge was a beast, a sleek brass tube driving a bullet faster than sound. At 1,000 yards it still struck with lethal force, punching clean through a helmet. With the Untold's 8-power magnification, a man half a mile away became intimate as a face across a room. McCall's instructors had drilled until the process was second nature. Breath, hold, squeeze, cycle the bolt, repeat. He had learned to trust math over adrenaline. Yet this was no sterile range. Here the enemy breathed, lived, dreamed of home. McCall felt a flicker of something human as he lined the crosshair on the older soldier's cheekbone. But war was about denying the enemy his next breath. He exhaled slow, the world compressing into a single heartbeat. The shot broke like glass. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, a clean, familiar recoil. Through the scope, he saw the older man jerk sideways, falling before he could scream. The younger froze, confusion flashing across his face. McCall worked the bolt smoothly, chambering the next round with an oiled click. Another breath, another shot. The boy collapsed beside his mentor. He stayed still after, watching the clearing ripple with panic as other Japanese scrambled for cover. A single rifle had halted an entire position. Somewhere, Tanaka might be among them. The young lieutenant, trying to impose order on men terrified by death they cannot locate. McCall could imagine him shouting commands, scanning tree lines for the phantom hunter. This was the psychological weight snipers carried into battle. Not just killing, but instilling paralysis. Tanaka had felt it before. Each time a man dropped without warning, fear crawled into the hearts of his soldiers like a living thing. He had seen the way silence spread after a long-distance kill, how even the bravest hesitated to rise from cover. A sniper's bullet was not loud like artillery or messy like machine gun fire. It was surgical, intimate, almost personal. It said, "Someone sees you when you cannot see him. Someone can take your life with a flicker you will never anticipate." Tanaka fought to hold his men together, barking orders, forcing patrols to move. But every invisible shot chipped away at morale. He remembered one particularly brutal day when a forward squad attempted to ferry ammunition across an exposed sandbar. The first man fell before he reached the midpoint. The second dropped, trying to drag him back. After that, no one would move. Tanaka himself had to crawl under sporadic fire, urging them onward. But by then, the tide of courage had ebbed. Even officers felt the tremor. The ancient warrior ethos clashing with this cold, mathematical predator lurking somewhere unseen. For McCall, too, the kills carried weight. Alone in the bush at night, he sometimes replayed the faces he had seen through glass. He wondered what they had believed about the war, about their families far away. But the mission was clear. Every shot saved Marines who might otherwise die in frontal assaults. Precision was mercy compared to chaotic bombardment. Still, the intimacy gnawed at him in quiet hours. A sniper knew his enemy's face before ending it. The Springfield itself demanded reverence. Designed decades earlier, it was a bolt-action relic to some, but to McCall, it was perfection. Its long barrel whispered stability. Its Mauser-inspired action never failed. The 30-06 bullet could fly supersonic to ranges few believed possible. The Untold scope, fragile but precise, required external adjustments. McCall would twist its knobs by feel, compensating for drop and drift. Every component demanded discipline. There was no rushing a 1,000-yard shot. In this patience, he found both power and unease. Tanaka began to study the Americans, desperate for countermeasures. He ordered his men to move unpredictably, to avoid skyline ridges, to dig deeper foxholes. They strung branches for concealment, used smoke when advancing. Yet none of it felt adequate. Their own rifles lacked the optics and training to answer in kind. Ammunition shortages meant few could even practice long-range fire. His reports warning of Marine sharpshooters earned polite dismissal. The command believed in spirit, in courage to overwhelm. Tanaka felt like a man trying to dam a river with his bare hands. McCall's legend grew. Units whispered about the ghost shooters, who could end a firefight before it began. Entire Japanese patrols slowed to a crawl, fearing the invisible eye. Sometimes McCall would wait hours for a single decisive shot, severing a chain of command by eliminating an officer or disabling a key weapon. He measured success not by bodies, but by silence, the way enemy movement froze when one man fell. Yet each success pushed Tanaka further into a quiet crisis. He had dedicated his life to Bushido, to leading men with honor. Now he was forced to instruct them in fear, to stay low, to avoid open ground, to suspect every rustle. The unseen rifle stripped away the dignity he had promised. More than once he stood alone after a retreat, fists clenched, cursing an enemy he could not fight face to face. One evening, after another failed attempt to advance across sniper-haunted ground, Tanaka found himself staring into the jungle, imagining the enemy's eye behind glass. He tried to picture this Marine, steady, patient, perhaps weary, but unflinching. A man not unlike himself, but armed with a different philosophy of war. It unsettled him more than he wished to admit. Spirit against science. Could spirit ever win? McCall, meanwhile, cleaned his rifle under the glow of a dim lantern. Around him, younger Marines laughed softly, relieved by the day's survival. He said little. Each part of the rifle gleamed with oil and care. He thought of the distant figures he had dropped that morning and of the lieutenant who had somehow kept men moving under fire. Respect, strange and unwanted, stirred in him. War was supposed to be faceless, yet through a scope it was anything but. Both men sensed a shift coming. The Japanese could not keep advancing blindly, and the Marines were learning to wield their ghost shooters with surgical precision. A clash loomed where courage and calculation would meet at close quarters. McCall tightened the screws on his inertial mount, testing the smooth glide of its adjustments. Tanaka lay awake, planning a path that might outwit the invisible hunters. Neither knew the other's name, yet their fates were entangled. Two soldiers shaped by opposite doctrines now circling toward inevitable confrontation. Somewhere in the dripping dark between them, the future of the island, perhaps the war itself, balanced on a single, unseen crosshair. The battle lines hardened as autumn rains turned the island's trails to rivers of mud. Sergeant Daniel McCall no longer moved like a man learning. He moved like a hunter, certain of his craft. Days bled into one another, crawling at night, sighting by dawn, striking by noon, and slipping away unseen. Each kill was a small adjustment in the great machine of war. Supply runners stayed underground. Machine guns went silent for hours. Entire platoons hesitated because one man with glass and steel had reminded them how fragile courage could be. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka felt that fragility keenly. His battalion was fraying under the invisible pressure. Every advance demanded he coax men forward against a threat they could neither confront nor predict. He studied maps with desperate care, searching for angles that would shield his soldiers from unseen rifles. Yet every clever route seemed to end in another corpse. Reports came in of key outposts silenced after a single distant shot. A forward bunker fell because its officer died before ordering resistance. McCall might have been one man, but to Tanaka, he was an entire shadow army. The Imperial command still clung to its faith in spirit. Reinforcements arrived with bayonets gleaming and banners bold, only to stall when the first scout fell without warning. Tanaka argued for counter-sniper patrols, better optics, anything to fight back, but was met with platitudes. "Courage is our shield," his superior said after another bloody report. Tanaka left the meeting hollow, knowing courage could not stop a bullet. He could not even see. McCall, for his part, felt the weight of what his work was doing. Each mission saved Marines from costly assaults, but also reshaped the battlefield in ways he could sense but not measure. Japanese movements became erratic. Fear coiled through their lines. He no longer thought of individual kills, but of paralysis, the way entire enemy companies crouched behind sandbags, unwilling to risk a step. Sometimes, after hours of silent watching, he saw Tanaka himself, a slim, upright officer moving carefully through the wreckage of morale, rallying men with a stiff back and quiet words. Through his scope, McCall studied the lieutenant's composure and felt an odd kinship. Both of them were trying to hold together worlds collapsing under new rules of war. The turning point came during a planned Marine assault on a heavily fortified ridge. Intelligence warned of machine guns and mortars waiting to shred the first wave. McCall and 2 other snipers were sent ahead under darkness. They lay for hours in the rain, hidden among twisted roots. When dawn broke and Japanese crews began adjusting their weapons, McCall's scope found the lead gunner, then the assistant, then the officer pointing orders. Each shot cracked like punctuation in the mist. By the time the Marines surged forward, the ridge's firepower was shattered. What could have been a massacre became a swift, brutal seizure. The Corps would remember it as one of the first times snipers decisively sculpted a battle's outcome. For Tanaka, the ridge was a nightmare. He arrived to find command posts abandoned, gunners dead where they had stood. His men had fought back with bravery, but no direction, leaderless after the first minutes. The defeat was more than tactical. It was psychological. Rumors of the ghost rifles swept through the ranks. Some soldiers whispered that the Americans had demons guiding their bullets. Tanaka crushed such talk, but he could not silence the hollow look in their eyes. That night he wrote in his journal, hands shaking, "How does one fight an enemy who is a shadow and a mathematician? Spirit feels like a sword swung at mist." McCall heard of the victory only in passing. To him, it was another day's work. Yet something inside shifted. Watching the ridge crumble, he realized the war was tilting toward men like him, solitary, calculating, unseen. He had wanted to be a good Marine, but now he wondered what it meant when wars turned into numbers. Range, wind, trigger weight. The thought left him cold, even as fellow Marines clapped his shoulder in gratitude. Still, the campaign ground on. Each side bled, but the balance of fear was changing. American units began embedding snipers in every advance. The Japanese, brave, but poorly equipped for counterfire, adapted by digging deeper and moving at night, slowing their offensives to a crawl. McCall's quiet craft was reshaping not just battles, but tempo, turning open charges into hesitant crawls. Tanaka tried to adapt as well. He ordered decoys built to draw fire, encouraged feints to reveal sniper nests. Some tricks worked briefly. Most ended with another man dead. Each failure weighed heavier, yet he refused to crumble. To his men he remained unshaken, though alone he felt the slow erosion of an ideal. He had believed war was a contest of souls. Now it felt like a chessboard played with rifles. One humid evening, after another ambush claimed his best scout, Tanaka stood at the edge of camp, staring toward Marine lines. Somewhere out there, he imagined, McCall was watching, a man he had never seen, but whose presence shaped every decision he made. Tanaka whispered to the dark, not a curse, but a quiet vow to endure. He would lead, even if the battlefield had changed beyond recognition. Survival, not blind sacrifice, was now his duty. At the same hour, McCall sat cleaning his Springfield under a starlit tarp. He thought of the officer who still managed to rally men under the threat of death from afar. He had spared him once, out of distance and doubt. Next time might be different. War rarely allowed respect to outweigh necessity. He slid the polished bolt home with a soft click, the sound both final and fragile. The island seemed to hold its breath again, as if sensing the duel that had grown from their parallel paths, spirit and science, patience and pride. Two soldiers remade by a conflict neither had imagined when they first shouldered rifles. The rain began to fall, gentle and steady, cloaking the jungle in mist once more. Somewhere, in that dark, unseen, eyes peered through glass, while another man tightened his grip on a sword meant to face enemies head-on. Their worlds were about to collide one last time, and neither could predict whose lesson the war would remember.